The shoulder of the road was narrow, uneven, soaked through with the kind of cold that didn't come from temperature. It came from being outside too long without anyone asking why. The girl walked with her arms crossed tight, backpack slung low, one strap fraying where it had been tugged too many times. Her hoodie was soaked through. The wind blew hard and careless, flattening her hair to her cheeks and turning each breath into a cloud she couldn't hide behind. Dusk was closing in, bleeding across the sky like something wounded. Headlights passed her every few minutes, but none of them slowed. Most didn't even swerve. She didn't look at them anymore. She'd stopped expecting things to stop. The bruises on her wrist were starting to throb again. She tugged the sleeve down farther, like that would help, but the fabric was already stretched thin. The road curved ahead, just enough to keep hope around the bend. Her shoes were soaked, soles nearly worn through. Every step was louder than the last. Then she heard it, the rumble of an old engine, slower than the others, not racing past, rolling. She didn't turn around. The truck pulled up beside her, a battered blue Chevy, rust curling along the wheel wells, one headlight flickering like it hadn't decided whether it still worked. It stopped a few feet ahead, engine idling low. The window rolled down halfway. "You headed somewhere, or just running from something?" The voice wasn't harsh, just honest. Male, tired, a breath above gravel. She turned slowly, met the driver's eyes. He looked older than he probably was, a beard that hadn't been trimmed in a while. Hands on the wheel like he wasn't sure if this counted as rescuing or inviting trouble. She didn't speak. He nodded toward the passenger door. "I've got a sandwich, and it's warmer than out here." She looked at the road ahead, then at the truck. Then she opened the door and climbed in. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. And the road kept going like it always did, wet, winding, and waiting for the weight of another story. The house was small, the kind that creaked when you walked too fast or closed a door too hard. The walls were chipped near the floorboards, and the heater coughed more than it breathed, but it was dry. And for a girl who hadn't been dry in 2 days, that was enough. She stood in the doorway, damp socks in her hands, jacket draped over the back of a chair like she wasn't sure if she was staying or just thawing. Mason moved through the kitchen with quiet shoulders. He didn't say much, just nodded once when she sat, then turned back to the stove. The pan hissed when the rice hit it, left over from 2 nights ago, maybe 3. He cracked an egg into it like it was currency, stirred slow, methodical. The smell filled the room. She didn't realize how hungry she was until then. He opened a dented can, dumped half the green beans into the pan, and left the rest for later. No meat, no seasoning beyond salt, but it smelled like survival, maybe even comfort. He plated it all on one dish, just one, no extra. When he slid it across the table toward her, she hesitated. Her fingers curled around the edges, like it might disappear if she blinked. "You sure?" she asked, voice hoarse, the first she'd spoken since getting in the truck. He didn't look at her, just leaned against the counter and took a sip from a chipped mug. "Yeah?" She took a bite, then another. Ate fast at first, then slower, like it hurt to be full after being empty too long. He said nothing, didn't press, didn't ask where she came from, who hit her, what the bruises on her wrist were hiding. Just watched the window like he was expecting the night to knock. Halfway through the plate, she looked up. "You got kids?" "One," he said. "Eli. He's with his aunt tonight." She nodded, chewing, then paused. "You didn't eat." He shrugged. "Not that hungry." They both knew he was lying, but she didn't push, and he didn't ask. And the silence between them was the kind that understood. The couch was older than she was. Springs creaked every time she shifted, and the cushions had that deep, sunken shape that said someone else used to call it home. Still, it was softer than pavement, warmer than the shelter floor she'd snuck out of 2 towns ago. She curled up slowly, careful not to take up too much space, though there was no one else there. Her backpack sat at her feet like a loyal dog, filthy, torn at one corner, one strap tied in a knot. She didn't remove her shoes, just unlaced them, loosened them enough to remind her she wasn't running right now. Mason didn't say much after dinner, just showed her the couch, offered a towel that smelled like clean laundry, not fabric softener, and pointed toward the bathroom like it was a map she could choose to follow or not. He didn't press, didn't ask. He just gave her space. She hadn't said good night. Now the house was quiet except for the faint buzz of the fridge and the wind knocking half-heartedly at the window. She lay on her side, eyes half open, watching the shadows on the ceiling stretch and shrink with passing headlights. Sleep didn't come easy. It never had. Not when your body learned to rest with one ear open, but sometime after the fourth car passed, she felt it. The weight of a quilt, heavy, old, familiar in the way only handmade things are. She didn't move, just stayed still as the fabric settled over her, soft at the edges, frayed along the seams. It smelled faintly of cedar and something deeper, like time, like someone's grandmother had made it when love was something stitched, not spoken. She didn't open her eyes, but she knew it was him. His steps were slow, careful. He didn't tuck it tight, just draped it, like he wasn't sure if he had the right. Then she heard him walk away. No good night, no words. But when the front porch light clicked off and the house slipped fully into sleep, she pulled the quilt a little closer and let herself believe, for one night, that maybe she could rest. The morning sun crept in slow, bleeding through the threadbare curtain in soft streaks of gold that touched everything like it had time. Mason stirred on the mattress in his room, the kind that sagged in the middle and made his back ache more than usual. He blinked at the ceiling, half asleep, letting the quiet tell him what kind of day it was. No footsteps, no rustle from the couch, just silence, still and clean. He swung his legs over the side and rubbed the sleep from his face. His feet found cold linoleum, and he winced. The floor always told the truth, no matter how warm the dreams might have been. The hallway felt emptier. He stepped into the living room and stopped. The couch sat bare, the quilt folded into a perfect square on the cushion, edges aligned too precisely for someone who was just in a hurry. Not the kind of fold you do when you're coming back, the kind you do when you're saying thank you without saying it out loud. His eyes drifted to the kitchen, plate in the dish rack washed and still wet, leaning against a chipped mug that hadn't been touched in weeks until last night. Fork placed beside it, tines down, careful. No note, no goodbye, just the echo of presence and absence. Mason leaned against the counter, arms crossed, staring at the plate like it might answer something. It didn't. It just sat there, proof that someone had been fed, warmed, seen. He glanced out the window, hoping, half expecting, to catch a glimpse of a backpack on a shoulder, a figure walking down the road with that same determined slouch. But the street was quiet, the truck still parked in the driveway, the world unchanged. Except it wasn't. Not really. He stood there for a long moment, then reached out and turned the plate upside down to dry fully. No words spoken, no explanations. But somewhere in that folded quilt and clean fork was a thank you he'd heard louder than anything she could have written, and the silence left behind wasn't empty. It just wasn't done talking yet. Mason's life ran on routine, the kind that didn't bend, didn't break, just pressed forward like a stubborn mule pulling too much weight. The house was small, sagging at the corners, with siding that flaked like dry paint off old bones. The porch light flickered every third night, and the front step leaned just enough to trip you if you weren't paying attention, but it stood, and that counted for something. His alarm went off at 5:30, not because he needed that much time, but because quiet was a currency he didn't get much of after sunrise. He made coffee first, black, burnt, bitter, and drank it in the dark kitchen, boots half-laced, jacket slung over the back of a chair. Then he made breakfast for Eli. Eli was 8, all elbows and big eyes with a head full of questions, and a backpack he refused to zip all the way. He loved pancakes, but got toast most mornings. They were out of syrup again. Mason worked 2 jobs, one at the tire shop and another cleaning up at the hardware store after hours. Neither offered insurance, and both paid in checks that felt more like IOUs. He kept a notebook in the junk drawer with everything they owed, everything they'd managed to pay, and everything he lied about not needing. He drove a '98 pickup that stalled at every 4th stop sign and made a sound like it was clearing its throat when it climbed a hill. But it ran, and he knew how to keep it that way. At night, after dinner and homework and Eli's bedtime stories, ones they made up together about space cowboys and talking engines, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a pencil, a calculator, and the kind of tired that didn't live in muscles but marrow. He didn't complain, not out loud, not even to himself. This was life, barely stitched together, but stitched all the same. Some nights, when the silence settled just right and Eli breathed soft down the hall, Mason let himself hope the edges would hold. That maybe, just maybe, getting by wouldn't always have to mean holding his breath. The pawnshop bell jangled with that tinny, apologetic sound, like even it knew why people came here. Mason stepped in slow, his guitar case hanging from one hand like a dead weight. The floor creaked under his boots. The place smelled like dust and lost promises, old speakers, wedding bands, tools that had changed hands too many times. He didn't browse, didn't stall. Just walked up to the counter and set the case down with a soft thud. The clerk was an older guy with bad posture and good memory. He looked at the case, then at Mason, then back at the case. "You sure?" he asked. Mason nodded once. "Need a week's groceries?" The man didn't haggle, didn't offer condolences, just opened the case, gave a slow whistle under his breath and slid a form across the counter. Mason filled it out in silence. The guitar had been his father's. Maple body, warm tone, the kind of wood that held songs even after the strings had gone quiet. Mason hadn't played in years, not since Eli was born, and things got complicated. But he kept it tuned, just in case. Some nights, when Eli was already asleep and the house was too still, he'd sit in the dark and play under his breath, just enough to remember. Now it was gone. The money wasn't much, enough for bread, milk, peanut butter, eggs if they were on sale, enough to keep Eli's plate from being empty, even if Mason stayed that way a while longer. At the shop, his manager handed him 2 extra shifts, said nothing about the tired circles under Mason's eyes or the grease he hadn't scrubbed fully from his knuckles, just pointed to the schedule and nodded. Mason nodded back, grateful in a way he couldn't say out loud. He didn't mention the girl, didn't bring up the plate of food or the quilt or the empty couch that felt like it remembered her. He just clocked in, head down, shoulders tight, and kept going. Because sacrifice didn't look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it looked like a pawn ticket and silence. It was the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Eli was kneeling on the floor, digging through the couch cushions for the remote, again. He liked to blame it on ghosts, but really, he just didn't sit still. The quilt was folded the way his dad had shown him, but he tugged it loose anyway, tossing it aside with a grunt. That's when he saw it. A scrap of paper, folded twice, small enough to hide between the cushions. He almost tossed it without thinking, but something about the way it was folded, tight, careful, made him pause. He opened it slowly, expecting a grocery list or maybe one of his dad's old notes to himself. But it wasn't that, just one word, written in neat, careful letters that tilted slightly to the right. Kayla. He stared at it for a long second, frowning. "Dad?" he called, walking into the kitchen. Mason looked up from the sink where he was rinsing out a thermos. "What's up, bud?" This was in the couch. Mason dried his hands, took the paper. His eyes moved across the letters, slow. He didn't say anything. "Is that her name?" Eli asked. Mason nodded once, then looked down at the scrap again. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, and something else, regret maybe, hope trying not to look like it was hoping. "She didn't tell me, Mason said softly. She didn't tell anyone. Eli shifted on his feet. Is she okay? I don't know, Mason answered, and it hit him harder than he expected, because he didn't. He didn't even know where she was, or if she had someone looking for her, or if she'd ever find her way back to somewhere safe. But now he had something, a name, real and written, proof that she existed outside the memory of one night and one quiet couch. Eli watched him for a second, then said, "We should keep it." Mason nodded again, slipped the paper into his wallet, behind the faded photo of Eli as a baby. It wasn't much, but it was more than before. The intake room smelled like disinfectant and old paper, pale walls, flickering lights, a plastic chair bolted to the floor in the corner like someone might try to run with it. Kayla sat with her hood up, arms wrapped tight around her middle, not from the cold, but from habit. Her backpack rested between her feet, the zipper half busted, one strap knotted where it had nearly torn through. A woman in a red fleece vest sat across from her, clipboard in hand, voice low and too gentle. "You don't have to tell me everything, just your name." Kayla didn't answer. She stared at the floor, watching the way the shadows moved beneath her sneakers. The scrape on her cheek had scabbed over. The bruise across her collarbone had turned that ugly mix of yellow and green. She hadn't looked at herself in days. "Kayla, right?" the woman asked, tapping the name she'd scribbled from the ID Kayla no longer carried. "Can you tell me where you came from? A city? A state? Anything?" Silence. "Are you running from someone?" Kayla blinked, but her face didn't move. No nod. No shake of her head. "Okay," the woman said quietly. "You don't have to talk now. You're safe here." Safe. The word didn't mean much. Not anymore. They gave her a bunk, bottom row, far end. Thin mattress, folded sheet, plastic bin for her things. She sat on the edge and stared at the blanket like it might say something back. The girl above her was snoring already. Across the room someone whispered into a phone until lights out shut everything down. Kayla didn't sleep. She lay still, eyes open, ears tuned for footsteps that didn't come. The smell of Mason's house still lingered in her hoodie, coffee, motor oil, and something warm she couldn't name. It made her chest ache. She hadn't meant to leave so early. She just didn't know how to stay. In the dark, she reached into her backpack, pulled out the folded drawing Eli had given her, a rocket ship with a dog in the window, and the words, "Safe Flight, Space Girl." She held it tight and waited for morning. The segment came on between weather and sports, just after the forecast called for rain, and before anyone cared about the high school football scores. A human interest piece, they called it, something soft to balance the headlines. Mason didn't usually watch the news, not unless Eli had the remote and the cartoons were over. But that night he was too tired to get up and change the channel. Eli had fallen asleep on the couch with his socks half off and a book open on his chest. The house was dim, quiet, the kind of stillness that didn't ask anything from him. So Mason let the anchors drone on while he sipped the last of his coffee. The segment started simple. Grainy footage of city streets, shelter footage, a voiceover about lost kids and second chances. He barely paid attention until he saw her. She wasn't looking at the camera, just sitting in a folding chair, hoodie pulled halfway up, hair tucked behind one ear like she was trying not to be seen. But Mason knew that face. His coffee hit the table too hard. Eli stirred in his sleep. The reporter said her name. "Kayla, 16, came through the Midwood Youth Shelter last month. She wouldn't tell us where she came from, but she did tell us what she was running toward." They cut to a clip of her speaking, voice soft, measured, careful. "Sometimes people don't ask questions," she said. "Sometimes they just hand you food and let you sleep. That night, it saved me." She didn't say his name, didn't say where, but Mason knew. The screen flickered to a graphic. National Runaway Prevention Month. Resources, hotline numbers. Then it was over. Just like that. Mason sat frozen. The TV hummed back to life with a car commercial he didn't hear. The coffee went cold. He looked over at Eli, still breathing slow on the couch, still unaware. Then he looked back at the screen and whispered the only thing he could manage. "She's alive." The television lit the living room in quiet pulses, blue, then white, then the soft fade of Kayla's face in profile. Mason didn't move, didn't blink. The coffee in his hand trembled slightly, the rim of the mug tapping once against his thumb like a metronome for the rising panic in his chest. Her voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it was something he recognized too well, someone holding herself together with thread and grit. She spoke like the words cost her something, and he could feel every one of them land. Across the room, Eli sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his little voice cutting clean through the thick quiet. "Dad," he said, pointing at the screen, "that's the girl from the couch." Mason's heart stopped for a beat. Eli was still staring, brow furrowed in the way he did when he was trying to solve something too big for his age. "That's her, right?" Mason nodded barely. "Yeah, buddy." "She was nice," Eli said. "She helped me draw rockets." Mason didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the screen as the segment faded out, Kayla's voice, her name, the words Midwood Youth Shelter flashing in clean white font before the anchors moved on like it hadn't just shattered something. He set the mug down slowly. His hands were slick with sweat. "I didn't think we'd see her again," Eli said, now fully awake, watching his father instead of the television. "She didn't say bye." "No," Mason said softly. "She didn't. But she left her name. She left the plate clean, the couch folded, the quilt tucked just so. She left, but she'd also come back, in a way he hadn't expected, through a screen and a story and a voice that still carried the weight of that one quiet night. Mason stood suddenly, walked to the window. The street outside was empty, just the hum of distant cars and the quiet ache of something unfinished. Eli pulled the rocket drawing from the fridge and sat with it in his lap. "Can we find her?" he asked. Mason didn't turn around, but he said, "We can try." The Midwood Youth Shelter sat behind a chain-link fence and a peeling blue sign, the kind of place that looked more like a repurposed clinic than a haven. Mason parked just past the curb, hands tight on the steering wheel, heart thudding with something he couldn't name, hope, dread, maybe both. Eli's drawing sat folded in the passenger seat, the creases worn soft from how many times Mason had run his thumb over them. He stepped out into the wind, tugged his jacket close. The air tasted like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Inside, the waiting room was pale and quiet, chairs lined up like question marks. A tired woman sat behind the front desk, her sweater pulled high around her neck, eyes already apologizing before he even spoke. "I'm looking for someone," Mason said, voice low but steady. "Her name's Kayla. She was here. I saw her on the news. She mentioned this place." The woman's lips tightened. She set down her pen. "We don't share information about our residents." "I'm not asking for personal details. I'm not here to cause trouble." He paused. "She stayed at my place once. Just one night. I gave her food, a couch. That's it. I just want to make sure she's okay." She studied him a moment longer, eyes searching for cracks. "She was here, briefly." Mason's chest lifted. "Can I see her?" "She's gone." His breath caught. "Gone where?" The woman's expression didn't change. "Transferred. We don't give out locations, especially not with minors. It's for their safety." He nodded slowly, trying to keep the fight out of his shoulders. "Can I leave something for her, in case she checks back in?" She hesitated, then pushed a blank sheet of paper toward him. "Write it. I'll make sure it goes in her file." Mason sat in the nearest chair, pen shaking in his hand. He wrote 2 lines. "You left a name. I kept it safe. If you ever need home again, ours is still here." He folded it, left the rocket drawing with it, and walked back out into a world that looked exactly the same. Except now, it carried the weight of one more almost. Mason slid the note across the desk, fingers reluctant to let it go. Beneath it, he tucked a worn index card with his cell number scrawled in thick black ink, twice, just in case the first one smudged. The woman behind the desk gave him a short nod, then tucked it into a file without looking at him again. That was it. That was all he could do. Outside, the sky had gone gray and stayed that way. Mason climbed into the truck, gripping the wheel longer than he needed to. Eli's rocket drawing was still on the seat, edges curling. He didn't move it, just drove home with it riding shotgun, like maybe it held better luck than he ever had. That night, he clocked in late to the hardware store. No one noticed. No one ever did. He stocked shelves in silence, hands moving by habit, while his mind kept circling back to the way the woman had said transferred, like it meant gone forever. During his break, he sat on a stack of lumber in the back, phone balanced in his palm. 1 bar of service. No messages, no calls. He refreshed it anyway. The second job, the tire shop, wasn't much better. Cold cement floors, busted radios playing static-heavy country. By day 3, his knuckles were raw and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. Every time the phone buzzed in his pocket, his chest tightened, only to sag when it was a telemarketer, a wrong number, a weather alert. But he kept checking. At home, Eli watched cartoons and asked fewer questions. Mason answered the ones he could. No, she hasn't called. No, I don't know where she is. Yes, I miss her too. He started leaving his phone on the table next to the front door at night. Just in case, screen always on low brightness, volume turned up. Sometimes in the middle of a shift or mid-sentence with a customer, he'd feel it buzz and stop breathing until he saw the screen. But it was never her. Still, he kept charging it, just in case. Kayla never unpacked fully. Not in the first foster home, where the woman was kind but distracted, her house filled with too many kids and not enough quiet. Not in the second, where everything smelled like bleach and dinners were microwave trays eaten in front of the TV. Each place gave her a bed, maybe a desk, sometimes rules pinned to the fridge, but never a reason to believe she'd be there long. She kept her backpack close, slept with it zipped, tucked under her arm. Inside, beneath a folded hoodie and an old dog-eared library book, was a photo, crumpled at the edges, slightly out of focus. Mason's house, taken from across the street the morning she left. No one was in the frame, just the front step, the dent in the truck door, the window where the curtain never quite closed. A place. Real. Still standing. School was a blur of lockers that didn't open right, and cafeteria tables that didn't make room. She kept her head down, turned in her homework, didn't cause problems. Teachers liked her for that, called her resilient. She hated the word. It sounded too much like, "You've survived worse," and not enough like, "You shouldn't have had to." At night, in the dim light of the latest spare room, she'd pull the photo from her bag and hold it like proof. A house with chipped paint, a couch that creaked, a man who gave her dinner and didn't ask what she'd done to end up on the side of the road. She'd told herself it didn't mean anything at the time, but it had. It still did. Every time she was moved, new zip code, new intake forms, new set of strangers, she'd check her bag first. The photo was always there, her anchor, her reminder. She didn't know why she hadn't gone back. Pride, maybe. Fear. Maybe she just didn't know how to walk back into something that had felt so close to good. But every step away from that night felt harder than the last. And every place that wasn't that house reminded her just how much of her had been left behind on that couch. She started writing them at the back table in the county library, far corner behind the stacks where no one watched too closely. The librarians had stopped asking questions after her third week in a row of showing up after school, always quiet, always on time, always alone. She used the lined paper from the front desk, a limit of 2 sheets per visit, and wrote slowly, deliberately, as if speed might make the words come out wrong. Sometimes she wrote in cursive. Sometimes she printed, neat and square. But every letter began the same. Dear Mason. She never used his last name. She didn't even know it, didn't need to. Mason was enough. Solid. Familiar. The name of someone who had handed her a plate of food without asking why her hands shook. In the letters, she told him everything she couldn't say out loud. About the second foster home where the man didn't hit, but didn't listen either. About the school counselor who smiled too wide and called her brave like it was a badge she didn't ask to wear. About the cold mornings where she'd sit on the steps before class, watching the parking lot like maybe he'd show up out of nowhere, like maybe he'd just know. She wrote about Eli, too, how she missed the sound of his feet pattering down the hall, the way he'd handed her that crayon drawing of a rocket and whispered, "It's for you, in case you ever want to fly away." But she never mailed them. Instead, she folded each one into fourths, pressed them into the middle of random books, inside biographies, cookbooks, mystery novels. She chose titles no one else ever seemed to check out. Books thick with dust and silence. Safe places. Hiding places. It wasn't about being found. Not really. It was about saying the words, putting them somewhere outside her chest before they calcified, giving them breath, even if only between pages. And maybe, deep down, it was also about the hope, the impossible, foolish hope, that someday, somehow, one of those books might find its way to him. And he'd read it, and know. It started with a phone call Kayla didn't expect and almost didn't answer. She stared at the unknown number blinking across the cracked screen of her loaner phone until it stopped, then rang again. When she finally picked up, a clipped voice on the other end introduced herself as a producer from a national network. Words like feature story, inspiring, opportunity tumbled through the receiver faster than Kayla could process. She sat at the edge of the twin bed in her third foster home, the blanket still folded military tight, her heart hammering in the silence that followed. The producer asked if she'd seen the clip from her local segment. She hadn't, but apparently someone else had, and it had gone further than she ever imagined it could. They wanted her to speak, on camera, not just about the night she left, but about what came after, the running, the shelters, the homes, and, more importantly, the moment everything shifted, when someone gave her food without condition and didn't ask where she'd been. "You'd be part of a youth leadership panel," the producer said. "Kids who've survived the system and are learning to shape it from inside out." Kayla stared at the wall where a thumbtack held up a photo of Mason's house. Faded now, the edges curling, still her compass. She said yes. 2 weeks later, she sat in a makeup chair under studio lights that buzzed with heat, her hands clenched in her lap. Other panelists shifted nervously beside her, an artist from Chicago, a foster advocate from Atlanta, a student from New York who'd already spoken to Congress. But all Kayla could think about was the couch with the folded quilt, the man who never asked for anything, the boy who gave her a rocket to fly away. They mic'd her up, counted down, 3, 2, 1. The cameras rolled. She took a breath. And somewhere in a small living room miles away, a tired man sitting in a broken recliner leaned forward at the sound of her voice, not knowing yet how much was about to change. The green room was colder than it looked. Gray couch, bottled water, a bowl of grapes no one touched. Kayla sat on the edge of the cushion, knees bouncing, fingers worrying the hem of her sleeve. Her shoes tapped quietly against the tile. Not nerves, no, not exactly. It was something deeper, something pressing against her ribs like a truth trying to climb its way out. The producer stood by the door, headset in place, clipboard hugged to her chest. She was efficient, kind in the way people are when they've been trained to be. "You ready?" she asked, her voice calm, professional. Kayla nodded, then paused. Her throat tightened. "Can I ask for something?" The producer tilted her head, brows lifting. "I want 1 minute, at the end," Kayla swallowed, "to thank someone who helped when I didn't know how to ask." There was a pause, long enough for Kayla to brace for a no, for logistics, for corporate rules, for airtime schedules. But the producer just studied her, saw the way her hands trembled slightly, and nodded. 1 minute. Kayla let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Thank you." "Make it count," the producer said gently. She left the room, and Kayla sat there, suddenly still. She thought about that night, how quiet the truck was, how warm the plate felt in her lap, how Mason hadn't asked her name but gave her a place anyway. She thought about Eli, about his sleepy smile, the crayon rocket he handed her like it was something sacred. She hadn't known how much that night mattered until it was the only one she couldn't forget. The door cracked open. "Kayla, you're on in 2. She stood slowly, heart racing now, not from fear but from the weight of what she was about to say out loud for the first time. The stage lights would be bright. The room would be full. But that minute, it would belong to her, and to the man who shared his last meal like it was enough for 2. The recliner leaned too far back on one side, the result of years of use and one too many late-night repairs Mason never got around to finishing. The remote barely held together, a strip of duct tape keeping the battery cover from falling off, and the volume button only worked if you pressed it with the corner of a thumbnail. Still, the TV came on. Eli sat on the floor with a bowl of cereal and his feet tucked under the coffee table. They weren't watching anything in particular, just flipping channels, letting the noise fill the space. Mason chewed slowly through a sandwich that was more bread than meat, the kind of dinner that told the truth about a paycheck. The screen flashed, a panel of teens sitting in crisp chairs under studio lights. The host smiled too wide. Mason reached for the remote, thinking about switching it to the weather. His thumb was halfway to the channel button when a familiar voice, faint, steady, cut through the noise. His hand froze. "When I was 16, I didn't think anyone would ever look at me and see something worth keeping." Mason sat up straighter, heart snagging in his chest. The camera cut to her, hair pulled back, eyes locked on the host with a steadiness that looked rehearsed but felt real. It was her. Kayla. Older somehow, sharper around the edges, but her. Eli turned around from the floor, his spoon paused midair. "Dad." Mason didn't answer. Couldn't. Kayla inhaled, shoulders lifting. "There was this man," she said. "He found me on the side of a road in the rain. He didn't ask me for anything. He just gave me food, a place to sleep. He handed me a plate like I wasn't broken." Mason's sandwich slipped from his fingers, landing on the plate with a soft thud. "I never told him what that night meant to me," she continued, "but it was everything. He gave me more than a meal. He gave me proof I was still worth saving." Then, clear as a bell, "His name was Mason?" The recliner creaked as he leaned forward, jaw clenched, eyes burning. She wasn't a memory anymore. She was speaking his name to the world. The stage lights softened around her, but Kayla barely noticed. Her heart pounded so loud she couldn't hear the cameras, couldn't feel the eyes watching her from the other chairs on the panel, or the quiet audience just beyond the glow. All she could hear was her own breath, and the memory. She looked straight ahead, past the host, past the teleprompter, into the lens, like maybe somehow he was on the other side. "He gave me more than food," she said, her voice steady now. "More than a couch and a warm place to sleep. I didn't even tell him my name, and he still made me feel like I mattered." A hush fell in the room. Not dramatic, just full. People weren't shifting, not blinking, just listening. She could see it in her mind like it was happening again. The chipped mug, the plate, filled even though she could tell it was the last of what he had, the way he didn't press when she flinched, the way he just saw her. "When you've been running for a long time," she said, fingers knotted together in her lap, "you start to think you don't exist anymore, that you're just passing through, like a ghost nobody sees and nobody misses." Her voice caught there, but she didn't stop. "But that night, he looked at me like I was real, like I was still here, and that," she added, blinking hard, "that saved me." A pause, not for effect, just breathe. She nodded once, almost to herself. "I still don't know why he stopped his truck, why he gave me his only meal, but I think maybe he knew what it felt like to be invisible, too." The host leaned forward, voice gentle. Do you know if he ever heard this, what you've shared? Kayla smiled, the corners of her mouth trembling. I hope he did. She looked into the camera one last time. Because I want him to know, he didn't just feed a hungry kid. He reminded her she was still worth the space she took up in the world. And somewhere, in a sagging chair held together by tape and quiet stubbornness, a man gripped the arms tight and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying not to fall apart in front of his son. She hadn't planned to say it, not out loud, not like this. Kayla could feel the tremble working its way up her throat as the host leaned in, voice soft but pressing. If you could say one last thing to him right now, what would it be? The lights weren't as hot as they had been, or maybe she just didn't feel them anymore. Her pulse was too loud, her palms damp in her lap. She took a breath, then another, slow and shallow, the way she'd learned to do when her knees felt like they might give out. She thought of the couch, the quilt, the sound of Mason washing a single dish in a too-quiet kitchen while she pretended to sleep. How he'd walked past her, like she was just another part of the house, not something broken he was stuck with. He never pitied her, never tried to fix her. He just let her be. And that, more than anything, was what made her feel whole. Her lips parted, but her voice didn't come at first. The host waited. The audience was still. Then, finally, Kayla leaned into the mic and whispered, I think of him as my dad. Silence, real silence. Not polite, not planned. The kind of hush that settles like snow when something sacred's been said. Her eyes shimmered under the lights. She didn't blink. I don't know if he ever thought of himself that way, she continued, her voice unsteady now, cracking around the edges. But when I was out there, alone, afraid, not sure I'd even make it through the night, he made me feel like I had someone. She pressed her hand to her chest, not for drama, just to hold the weight of it still. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't try to save me. He just opened the door, made me dinner, called me kid. Her voice broke, and she didn't hide it. And I've been carrying that night with me ever since, because that's what a dad does. The camera didn't cut. The room didn't breathe. And back in a worn recliner hundreds of miles away, Mason sat frozen, heart cracked wide open, tears on his cheeks, as his son whispered beside him, voice full of awe. She chose you, Dad. The phone started ringing before the segment ended. At first it buzzed once, then again, until it practically danced across the kitchen table. Mason didn't move. He sat in the living room, elbows on his knees, staring at the blank TV screen where Kayla's face had just been. Eli watched him like the world might crack if he looked away. The fifth call was a reporter, some station in Chicago. Mr. Mason, can you confirm? He hung up. Then a message from someone he hadn't heard from in years. An old high school friend texting a screenshot of Kayla's face and the caption, "You see this?" Holy hell, man. Then a voicemail from a radio host in Austin, then another. The phone buzzed again. Mason reached for it like it might burn him. Unknown caller, no name, no city, just possibility. He stood up slowly, the chair groaning behind him, and stepped into the kitchen. The old tile felt cold under his socks, grounding. Eli followed but didn't speak. Mason answered on the third ring. Hello? There was a pause. Breath? Then her voice, quiet, unsure, and somehow exactly the same. Hi, it's me. He gripped the phone tighter. His knees almost gave. Kayla! A silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of every second since the couch, the plate, the night she disappeared. He didn't know what to say, so she kept going. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I wasn't sure I'd ever hear from you again, he said, voice rough with truth. Another pause. I didn't know how to come back, she admitted, but I never stopped thinking about it. I didn't know if I was still allowed. He leaned against the counter, blinking hard. You were always allowed, he said. Always. The line held between them like breath. Eli tugged at his sleeve. Is it her? Mason nodded slowly, Yeah, bud, it's her. And for the first time in a long time, something in his chest stopped holding its breath. Hi, it's me. The words came out small, thinner than she meant, but they filled the silence like they had weight. Kayla sat on the edge of a borrowed bed in a town 2 hours away, legs tucked under her, phone pressed to her ear like it might break if she held it too tight. On the other end, Mason didn't say anything at first, just breathed. She stared at the window across from her, watching the breeze nudge the curtain like it knew something was shifting. Her fingers fumbled with the hem of her sleeve. "I wasn't sure if I should call," she said. "I didn't know how to come back." Her voice cracked on back. She bit the inside of her cheek, hard, like she could punish the fear out of her. "But I never stopped thinking about it," she whispered. "About the house, about you, Eli, the couch, that dinner. I know it was one night, and you probably didn't even think I'd remember, but—" "I remembered," Mason said quietly. She stopped, pressed the heel of her palm to her eye. "I remembered the couch being warm," she said, "and the way you didn't make me explain anything. I didn't know people like that existed." "You mattered," he said. "That was enough." Kayla nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "There were times," she said, "when I was staying places, foster homes, group shelters, and everything felt cold, and I'd just picture your kitchen, that old stove, the noise the fridge made. It was stupid, I know, but it helped." "It's not stupid," he said. "It's home." That word hit her square in the chest. She exhaled, slow. "I don't know what this is. I don't want to ask for more than you're ready to give. I wanted you to know that you changed something in me." She paused. "That you were the first person who didn't make me feel like a problem." Mason's voice, quiet, steady, reached through the line like an anchor. "You were never a problem, Kayla. You were just a kid who needed to be seen." And finally, she let herself believe it. The porch light flickered once as she stepped up to the door, the same one she'd crept out of before sunrise all those months ago. The paint was still peeling near the bottom, and the screen door still had that telltale creak, but everything felt softer, familiar in a way that pressed at her chest. She hadn't brought much, just her backpack, a clean pair of shoes, and the crumpled photo of the house that had lived inside her bag for too long. She paused before knocking, but the door opened anyway. Mason stood there, dish towel in one hand, eyes just as tired, just as kind. Behind him, the smell of something warm drifted out, garlic maybe, or onions cooking down the way patient food always did. "You came back," he said, not as a question, just a quiet fact. She nodded, smile already rising to her lips before she could stop it. "You left the porch light on." He stepped back without a word, just enough to let her in. Eli looked up from the table, a spoon in his mouth, eyes going wide. "Kayla," he said around a mouthful of rice, "you're really here." "I'm really here," she said, dropping her bag by the couch, the same couch, the quilt still folded neatly at the end. Dinner was simple, rice, beans, chicken, in a pan sauce that clung to the plate in just the right way. Eli talked enough for all three of them, his hands flying with each new story. Mason just watched, his fork moving slow, like he didn't want to look away too long. Kayla kept smiling. Every bite tasted like something more than food, like forgiveness, like memory made edible. When Mason stood to clear the dishes, she stopped him. "You forgot," she said, pointing to the pan. He blinked. "Forgot what?" "There's still enough for seconds." He hesitated, then chuckled under his breath. "Guess I never expected the table to feel full again." "It does now," she said, and when she went for her second helping, it was with hands that no longer trembled. The night had thinned to quiet. Dinner plates were stacked in the sink, soaking beneath warm water and a drop of dish soap that Mason would get to later. Eli had passed out on the couch halfway through a rerun, a blanket bunched around his knees and one sock falling off. The TV buzzed low, a soft hum that filled the silence like an old friend. Kayla stood in the doorway of the kitchen, hands tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie. She'd been watching Mason move around the kitchen, drying his hands, wiping down the counter. The ordinary motions of a man who didn't know how to stand still. She took a breath, but it caught halfway up her throat. He turned toward her. She tried again. "I was thinking—" Her voice trailed, then steadied. "If it's not too much, maybe I could stay. For a little while, or longer, if that's okay." Mason didn't answer right away. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, eyes soft. He looked at her the way he had that first night, when she was soaked, quiet, waiting for the next door to close. "You never left," he said. Kayla blinked. "What?" He nodded slowly. "You've been here since the minute you stepped through that door. Doesn't matter where you went. This place, this house, has had your name written on it since that night." She looked down, mouth trembling just a little. "Even after I disappeared?" "You didn't disappear," he said. "You survived. You kept going, and I never stopped hoping you'd come back." Her throat tightened, and this time she didn't fight the tears that slipped down her cheeks, silent, unannounced, but clean. "I thought about this place every day," she whispered. "I didn't know if I had the right to ask for it again." "You don't have to ask," Mason said. "Family doesn't knock." She crossed the room then, and he pulled her into a hug that didn't ask questions. It wasn't loud or cinematic, just arms around her, steady and warm. And for the first time, she let herself believe in the word. Home. The drawing appeared on the fridge one morning, without announcement. No presentation, no proud unveiling. Just there, taped slightly crooked next to the grocery list, and a faded photo of Eli in kindergarten with chocolate on his chin. Kayla saw it while reaching for the milk. She froze, carton in hand, her fingers going still. Crayon lines, bold and uneven, covered the sheet of printer paper in colors that bled over their outlines. A stick figure version of Mason stood in the center, tall and wide, a smile stretching across his face. Next to him, Eli, with his signature spiky hair and a red cape, drawn flapping behind him, like always. But this time, there was a third figure, smaller than Mason, taller than Eli, wearing a hoodie and jeans, the sleeves exaggerated, the shoes big and boxy. Brown crayon hair, a face with eyes that looked directly out. She was holding Eli's hand, and above the group, in blocky handwriting that curved slightly upward, "Me, Dad, and Kayla." No last names, no explanation, just her, in the picture. She stared at it too long. When Eli padded into the kitchen, hair a mess and socks mismatched, he didn't even look up from the cereal box he carried. "I didn't know what color your eyes were," he mumbled through a yawn, "so I made them blue like mine." Kayla turned, blinking fast. "They're brown," she said softly. "Oh," he shrugged. "That's okay. I'll fix it later." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, she set the milk on the table, sat down across from him, and watched him dump cereal into a bowl like it was just another Tuesday. It wasn't. Because in that drawing, taped with one strip of yellowing Scotch tape, she wasn't a guest. She wasn't a visitor, she was in it. And sometimes that's all it takes, a few crooked lines and a name written beside yours, to know you've been chosen, not out of obligation, but love, quiet, permanent, and real. The classroom smelled like pencil shavings and nerves, the kind of space where kids fidgeted in chairs that squeaked too much, and the overhead lights buzzed just loud enough to make you second-guess your words. Kayla stood at the front of the room, palms flat against the wood podium, her note cards trembling slightly in her hands. It was her turn. She glanced out at the rows of students, some whispering, some doodling, most barely paying attention. A few teachers leaned in the back, arms crossed, expressions unreadable. They were doing a series on personal triumphs, stories about getting through something hard. She'd signed up without thinking, then nearly backed out twice. But now she was here, heart thudding, breath shallow. She looked down at the first card, then back up. "My name's Kayla," she said, voice clearer than she expected, "and I want to talk about building things. From scraps." A few kids looked up. One girl stopped clicking her pen. Not like building furniture or fixing bikes, she went on, but people, lives, the kind of things that fall apart and don't look worth keeping. She paused, let that land. I used to think broken meant useless, she said. That if you came from the wrong place or made too many wrong choices, there wasn't anything left to save, that all you could do was keep moving, keep hiding. Her voice didn't shake now. But then someone gave me a place at their table, not because I earned it, not because I explained myself, just because I was hungry and they had food, because I needed a couch and they had a quilt. She didn't look at the teachers. She didn't need to. I've learned that sometimes the strongest things are built from the pieces no one else wanted. That love can be quiet, that second chances don't show up in headlines. They show up in casseroles and crayons and someone remembering your name. The room had stilled. She folded her final note card, looked out at all of them. I'm not fixed, she said, but I'm not lost anymore. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't scare her. It felt like belonging. Mason didn't even know the segment had gone viral until the mail started piling up. At first, it was just a few envelopes, one with no return address, and a 20 tucked inside, scrawled in pen. She reminded me of my daughter. Then more came. Letters from strangers in towns he'd never been to, a teacher in Wisconsin, a retired mechanic from Oklahoma. One woman sent a homemade quilt, folded carefully with a note that simply said, "For Kayla." Then the emails came, routed through the school's admin office because Mason had never set up anything official. A college student in Seattle wanted to help with books. A nonprofit asked if they could highlight his story on their newsletter, and then someone sent a check. 4 digits, no strings. Eli opened the door one afternoon to a UPS delivery. Tools, new ones, still in boxes, wrapped in brown paper with the words, "Every fixer needs the right gear," sharpied across the side. Mason stood in the middle of the living room with a hammer in his hand and disbelief on his face. The roof had been leaking for 2 years, slow, steady, like it knew better than to collapse, but wanted to remind him it could. Now, with what had come in, he could fix it, for real, not with tarps or buckets. He could finally replace the shingles, the insulation. He walked out to the porch, sat on the steps, and stared out at the dirt driveway, like it might offer some kind of explanation. Kayla came out a few minutes later, holding a stack of letters. "You okay?" she asked. He looked up at her and nodded, slow. "Yeah," he said, "just didn't expect any of this." She sat beside him, set the letters in his lap. "They didn't send it for the story," she said quietly. "They sent it for the moment you didn't look away." He swallowed, blinking hard. She leaned her shoulder into his, familiar now, solid. The roof would get fixed. But it wasn't about shingles anymore. It was about the feeling rising in his chest, unfamiliar, sharp, and real. It was hope. And for once it didn't feel like too much to ask. The pen hovered for a long time over the signature line. Mason sat at the laminate desk in the back of the county office, the smell of coffee and paper and old air conditioning pressing in from every corner. A woman behind the glass partition watched patiently, fingers steepled over a manila folder labeled Kinship and Guardianship Petition. Her tone had been kind. Her eyes had been sharper, like she'd seen enough good intentions fall apart before the ink ever dried. Kayla sat in the chair beside him, quiet, her hoodie sleeves pushed over her hands the way she did when she wasn't sure what to do with her fingers. She hadn't spoken since they walked in. Neither had he. The forms had started simple: name, date of birth, proof of residence. The basics. Then the questions got harder. History, financial standing. Why now? Why her? That one stuck in his throat when he read it. Not because he didn't know, but because there wasn't a box big enough for the answer. Not just because she needed a place, not just because she stayed. Because she changed the way the house sounded. Because Eli's laughter came easier when she was in the room. Because the seat at the dinner table where he used to glance, empty, without thinking, was full now, and felt like it had always been meant for her. because kindness was how it started. But it wasn't just kindness anymore. "I can walk out," Kayla said, her voice small but steady. "If it's too much. You don't owe me—" He turned, cut her off with just a look, firm, unshaking. "I'm not signing this because I owe you," he said. "I'm signing it because you're mine. And you've been mine since the first night you rinsed that plate and folded the quilt." Her eyes burned then, so did his. He signed his name in a slow, uneven scrawl, the pen dragging slightly, as if the paper needed time to understand what forever meant. When it was done, he exhaled, and for the first time in years, the weight he carried didn't feel like burden. It felt like family. The morning was quiet. No interviews, no lights, no one asking for sound bites or staged hugs. Just the sound of a paintbrush swiping slow across metal, the bristles thick with white that dried fast in the late spring sun. Eli stood nearby with a rag in one hand and a cup of lemonade in the other, watching, like it was sacred work. Mason leaned over the mailbox, steadying the brush as he traced the letters. James had always been there, faded but strong. But now, just below it, in smaller but no less certain letters, Kayla James. The paint glistened, no flourish, just two names, side by side, like they'd always belonged that way. Kayla stepped out onto the porch, her hair still damp from the shower, sleeves rolled high on her hoodie. She saw it before he called her over, before Eli could point and shout with that grin that filled up his whole face. Her steps slowed. She came closer, eyes fixed on the name. Her name, no stage, no audience, just wood creaking under her feet, and the sun warming the spot where the ink used to be hers alone. Mason straightened, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stepped back. "Figured it was time," he said. His voice didn't wobble, but it hit her like it might have. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at it, the brushstrokes still wet and imperfect. Her throat tightened. "Looks good," she finally said. "Real good." "You should be on there," Eli added. "It's yours too." And that was the part that cracked her, because for so long she'd been passing through, borrowing names, borrowing rooms, holding herself just enough apart in case something broke. But here, under that name, on that box that caught the morning light just right, it wasn't borrowed, it was hers. She crouched beside it, ran her fingers under the still tacky paint, then stood, looked at them both, and whispered, "Home." No cameras caught it, no article would run it. But the world shifted on its hinge in that moment. Not loud, just enough, and that was all she'd ever needed.